If you stripped medieval life down to one brutal question, what protein still feeds you when war closes roads, winter kills livestock, and crops fail? The answer appears again and again in records, diets, and survival accounts. Fish. Not because medieval people preferred it, and not because it was abundant everywhere, but because fish solved a problem no other protein could solve at scale. It could be preserved, transported, rationed, taxed, stockpiled, and eaten during crisis without collapsing entire food systems. Fish didn't become the most reliable medieval protein by accident. It earned that position through physics, religion, geography, and systems logic, all working together in ways modern food systems barely resemble. The first reason fish dominated medieval protein is preservation efficiency. Fresh meat spoils quickly. Livestock requires constant feed, water, and protection. In famine or siege, animals become liabilities. Fish, by contrast, could be transformed almost immediately after capture into a form that resisted time. Salting, drying, smoking, fermenting, these methods didn't just slow decay, they stopped biological collapse long enough to cross continents. Salted fish was medieval protein in its most concentrated form. Salt pulled moisture from flesh, collapsing the environment bacteria need to survive. A properly salted fish could last months, sometimes years, without refrigeration. This made fish uniquely mobile. It could be caught on a coast and eaten hundreds of miles inland long after the sea was out of sight. No other protein traveled this well. This is why fish created entire medieval trade networks. Herring fisheries in the North Sea fed inland Europe. Cod from cold Atlantic waters became staple protein in places that never saw the ocean. River fish moved between regions as preserved goods, not fresh luxury. Protein stopped being local and became strategic. Religion amplified this reliability. Medieval Christianity imposed fasting rules that restricted meat consumption for large portions of the year, sometimes nearly half the calendar. Fish was exempt. This wasn't just spiritual, it created constant demand, which stabilized fishing economies and preservation knowledge. While meat demand fluctuated, fish demand never collapsed. Systems that survive are systems that are used continuously. Because fish was acceptable on fasting days, medieval societies were forced to build infrastructure around it: smokehouses, salting sheds, drying racks, barrels, warehouses, and trade routes. That infrastructure didn't disappear during famine or war. It was already there, already running, already scaled. Fish also avoided one of the greatest protein risks medieval people feared: disease amplification. Large herds concentrated disease. One outbreak could wipe out years of investment. Fish populations were distributed across rivers, lakes, and oceans. Even when one fishery collapsed, others remained. This distributed risk made fish protein systemically safer than livestock. In times of war, fish became even more valuable. Armies destroyed fields and slaughtered animals deliberately, but rivers still flowed. Seas could not be burned. Fishing continued even as land-based food systems collapsed. In besieged cities near water, fish often became the last reliable protein source long after meat disappeared. Fish also required less fuel to prepare. Salted or dried fish could be eaten with minimal cooking. In crisis, fuel scarcity mattered as much as food scarcity. Boiling grain already consumed wood. Cooking meat demanded more. Fish, especially dried varieties, could be soaked and eaten with little heat. This made fish protein fuel efficient, a hidden but decisive advantage. Then there's storage density. A barrel of salted fish held more usable protein per volume than fresh meat. It stacked well, it moved well, it rationed cleanly. Medieval administrators could calculate fish supplies precisely. This made fish ideal for institutions: monasteries, castles, armies, ships, and cities. Wherever large groups needed predictable protein, fish appeared. Fish protein also integrated seamlessly with medieval preservation culture. It paired with grain, bread, legumes, and fermented foods. It didn't require fresh vegetables to remain safe. It could be eaten in monotonous diets without immediate collapse. This mattered during long winters and sieges where variety disappeared. Even nutritionally, fish quietly outperformed expectations. Cold water fish provided fats that sustained energy. Small fish eaten whole supplied minerals. Fermented fish products retained nutrients lost in other preservation methods. Medieval people didn't know omega-3s, but they knew fish kept bodies functioning when other foods failed. What's striking is that medieval people trusted fish. Trust matters in survival. Fish preservation had predictable outcomes. Meat spoiled unpredictably. Grain failed in bad years. Fish, once salted or dried correctly, behaved reliably. That reliability made it central to planning. By the late medieval period, fish wasn't just food, it was policy. Laws regulated fishing seasons. Rivers were protected. Fish weirs were controlled. Fish taxes funded cities. Fishing rights sparked conflicts. You don't regulate something this tightly unless it is essential to survival. Modern people often imagine medieval fish consumption as cultural preference or religious quirk. In reality, it was systems engineering under constraint. Fish won because it solved more survival problems than any other protein available. And here's the uncomfortable part. When modern supply chains break, the same logic reappears. Canned fish, dried fish, salted fish, these are still the proteins that move, store, and endure when refrigeration, fuel, and logistics fail. Fish didn't become the most reliable protein medieval people because medieval people were limited. It became the most reliable because it worked when everything else stopped. The medieval world treated fish as a protein that could survive time, and time was the enemy in every crisis. One of the most decisive advantages fish had over land meat was predictable seasonality. Livestock required year-round input. Fish required timing. Medieval people learned exactly when fish were fattest, when they migrated, when they spawned, and when preservation worked best. This meant protein harvesting was synchronized, not constant. Entire communities paused normal life to catch and preserve fish during narrow windows, then lived off that labor for months. Herring runs, for example, were treated like gold rushes. Coastal towns exploded into controlled chaos as fish were caught, gutted, salted, and packed at industrial scale, centuries before industrial food existed. This wasn't peasant improvisation, it was organized, regulated, and optimized. Salt supplies were stockpiled in advance. Barrels were prepared ahead of time. Labor was assigned by role. If preservation failed, starvation followed. Failure was not tolerated. This ability to convert short bursts of abundance into long-term protein security made fish unbeatable.
Then there was salt logic, a resource medieval planners understood deeply. Salt was heavy, expensive, and precious, which is why fish preservation was so carefully engineered to use salt efficiently. Meat required deep salting or constant resalting. Fish required far less salt per calorie preserved. Cold water fish especially responded well to light but precise salting. This made fish protein scalable even when salt supplies were limited. Salted fish also aged predictably. Meat spoiled suddenly. Fish deteriorated gradually. That difference mattered enormously. Medieval planners could detect failure early, smell, texture, brine clarity, and respond before total loss. Predictable decay is survivable. Sudden collapse is not. Fish also had a labor advantage. Once preserved, it required almost no maintenance. Livestock demanded constant care even during famine. Fish demanded attention only during catch and preservation. After that, it waited. In a world where labor was scarce during crisis, waiting food was priceless. This is why monasteries became some of the largest fish consumers and distributors in medieval Europe. Monastic life required stable, predictable diets that complied with fasting laws and endured long winters. Fish fit perfectly. Monasteries invested heavily in fish ponds, weirs, and preservation facilities, not because fish was spiritual, but because it was administratively reliable. Fish ponds are especially revealing. These weren't decorative water features, they were living protein reserves. Fish could be harvested gradually, allowing protein extraction without slaughtering herds. In emergencies, ponds were drained completely. This made fish a protein that could be liquidated slowly or all at once, depending on need. No livestock offered that flexibility. Fish also avoided a hidden medieval fear: waste cascades. When livestock died unexpectedly, the loss was total. When fish spoiled partially, it could sometimes still be used, fed to animals, fermented further, or consumed quickly before collapse. Losses were rarely absolute. That mattered psychologically and practically. In armies, fish became the protein of movement. Marching soldiers couldn't transport live animals easily. Meat spoiled, fish endured. Salted fish fed troops without tying them to land. Naval forces depended on fish almost entirely. You cannot keep cattle at sea. Fish was not just protein, it was mobility. Even siege warfare quietly revolved around fish. Cities near rivers or coasts often survived longer because fishing could continue under cover of walls. Nets could be cast at night, fish traps could operate passively. Unlike fields, water could not be burned. This gave fish a defensive advantage no crop or animal shared. What's often missed is how fish integrated into ration math. Fish protein paired efficiently with bread and legumes. It didn't require fats to be edible. It could be portioned thinly without losing nutritional value. Medieval ration planners could stretch fish across populations without triggering immediate collapse. Fish also shaped taste tolerance. Medieval people grew accustomed to strong, salty, fermented flavors because those flavors meant safety. Fresh meat was a luxury, preserved fish was certainty. Over time, taste adapted to survival. This cultural adaptation made reliance on fish psychologically sustainable. And here's the deepest layer. Fish didn't compete with agriculture, it complemented failure. When crops failed, fish stepped in. When herds died, fish endured. When trade stopped, fish already sat in barrels. Fish didn't depend on the same variables that killed other food systems. That independence made it indispensable.
Modern people often frame medieval fish consumption as religious restriction or cultural habit. In reality, it was systems resilience disguised as tradition. Fish became the most reliable medieval protein because it aligned with every survival requirement simultaneously. Preservable, portable, predictable, scalable, rationable, fuel-efficient, disease-resistant, and administratively manageable. No land protein checked all those boxes. And the final irony is this: when modern supply chains fracture, we still return to the same solution: canned fish, dried fish, salted fish, shelf-stable protein that waits quietly while everything else fails. Medieval people didn't rely on fish because they lacked options. They relied on fish because it never betrayed them when everything else did. Once fish became dependable, societies began building around it, and that changed everything. Entire medieval calendars were shaped by fish cycles. Fishing seasons dictated labor schedules the way harvest seasons dictated farming life. Coastal and river communities synchronized work, rest, and preservation around spawning runs and migrations. This timing allowed medieval societies to convert natural abundance into stored security with minimal waste. Unlike crops, which demanded months of protection in the field, fish demanded intense effort for a short time, then waited patiently in barrels. That labor compression mattered. It freed people to do other survival work: repairing buildings, storing grain, preparing for winter, defending settlements. Fish did not compete with agriculture for time, it complemented it. Fish also reshaped medieval economics in a way few foods ever have. Because preserved fish traveled well, it became one of the first truly standardized food commodity. A barrel of salted herring meant roughly the same thing in one town as in another. This allowed pricing, taxation, and contracts that were reliable even during unstable periods. Grain varied wildly, meat varied wildly, fish behaved consistently. This consistency made fish ideal for institutional feeding. Monasteries, universities, hospitals, castles, and armies all relied on fish because it simplified logistics. You could stockpile it, you could count it, you could plan months ahead without gambling on weather or disease. Administrators trusted fish more than almost any other food. Fish even influenced urban growth. Cities near rivers, coasts, or fish trade routes grew faster and survived longer. When food systems collapsed elsewhere, these cities endured. Water access wasn't just about drinking, it was about protein continuity. Some inland cities thrived entirely because fish trade linked them to distant seas. Religious fasting, often misunderstood as restriction, actually stabilized fish demand. Because fish consumption was required so frequently, fishing industries never collapsed during peacetime. Skills were maintained, infrastructure stayed active. When crisis hit, the system didn't have to be rebuilt, it was already running. That continuity is rare in food systems. Fish preservation also encouraged technological refinement. Barrels improved, salting techniques became precise, drying racks evolved, smoking methods standardized. Medieval people were not guessing, they were optimizing. Mistakes meant hunger, success meant survival. One of the most revealing aspects is how fish reduced political vulnerability. Rulers who controlled fish supplies controlled stability. Access to fisheries became strategic. Rivers were guarded. Coastal rights were defended. Fish was power. It fed soldiers, appeased cities, and prevented revolt. Grain shortages sparked unrest. Fish shortages prevented it.
Fish also influenced dietary resilience. Populations accustomed to fish-heavy diets adapted physiologically and culturally to preserved protein. Salt tolerance increased, cooking methods simplified, expectations lowered. This adaptability allowed societies to endure monotony without collapse. Food that people psychologically accept matters as much as nutrition. Even during plagues, fish maintained relevance. Livestock died, fields went untilled, fish remained in water, less affected by human population collapse. Fishing labor could resume quickly. Protein supply rebounded faster than land-based systems. Medieval societies didn't just eat fish, they planned failure around it. One of the least discussed reasons fish remained reliable is that it decoupled survival from land ownership. Land failed often. Drought, frost, war, taxes, and disease could wipe out crops and herds in a single season. Fish, by contrast, existed outside the agricultural cycle. Rivers and seas did not belong to individual peasants in the same way fields did. They were communal, regulated, and harder to monopolize completely. This made fish protein socially stabilizing. Even when land-based inequality worsened, access to fish often remained partially intact. This is why medieval laws obsessively regulated fishing rights, not to restrict food, but to prevent total depletion. Closed seasons, gear restrictions, protected spawning grounds, these were not environmental ideals, they were survival logic. Overfishing meant starvation later. Medieval societies learned this lesson painfully and encoded restraint into law long before modern conservation language existed. Fish also solved a problem medieval planners rarely stated openly: protein during moral collapse. In famine and siege, social order breaks down. Theft rises, violence increases. Livestock becomes dangerous to keep. Animals are stolen, slaughtered, or destroyed. Fish, once preserved and sealed in barrels, was harder to steal unnoticed. Its distribution could be controlled. This made it administratively safer during chaos. Another subtle advantage was invisibility. Grain stores were obvious targets. Herds were visible. Fish stored in cellars, monasteries, warehouses drew less attention. In some sieges, written records show fish reserves lasting longer simply because attackers underestimated them. Fish didn't signal abundance the way bread or meat did. Fish also fit medieval ration psychology better than meat. Meat creates expectation. When meat disappears, morale collapses faster. Fish, already associated with fasting and restraint, normalized scarcity.
This psychological framing mattered during long crises. People tolerated fish-heavy diets longer without rebellion because it aligned with cultural narratives of endurance and discipline. Then there's fuel scarcity, a factor modern people underestimate. During famine and siege, firewood disappeared quickly. Cooking became dangerous. Fish's ability to be eaten with minimal preparation, soaked, reheated briefly, or consumed cold, extended survival when fuel ran out. Meat could not do this reliably. Grain required boiling. Fish often did not. Fish preservation also integrated perfectly with barter economies during crisis. A barrel of fish could be divided, traded, or taxed without losing value. Meat spoiled too fast. Grain was too politically sensitive. Fish moved quietly through informal networks, keeping local economies alive when formal markets collapsed. Even children's survival quietly depended on fish. Salted or dried fish could be softened and mixed into gruels, providing protein to those who couldn't chew hard foods. This reduced child mortality during prolonged shortages. Medieval people didn't calculate amino acids, but they noticed who survived. Fish also reduced seasonal hunger gaps. The worst medieval hunger wasn't winter, it was late spring, when stores ran low and harvest was months away. Fish runs often occurred during these gaps. Herring, river fish, and coastal catches bridged the most dangerous nutritional window of the year. That timing alone saved countless lives. What becomes undeniable is that fish wasn't just reliable, it was strategically timed by nature itself to appear when humans needed it most. And perhaps the most revealing layer is this. Medieval people never trusted a single protein source. They trusted overlap. Fish overlapped with grain. Fish overlapped with legumes. Fish overlapped with fasting rules. Fish overlapped with trade and war and climate. That overlap made systems resilient. Modern food systems chase optimization. One protein, one supply chain, one solution. Medieval systems chased redundancy. Fish was redundancy made edible.